Hey everybody, I've been asked to talk about communities of learning and what constitutes community and what constitutes a community of learning and how to create a community of learning in the classroom, whether you're going to be in person or virtual. And we want to focus in two parts of this process of community building. One is understanding what a community is, whether it's a physical community or a virtual community. And as a sociologist, looking at communities and understanding what makes a community is a topic that's pretty important to us. The second piece is how then to take some practical steps to create a community of learning in your classroom. Now, first, we have to understand what constitutes a community and what constitutes a virtual community. And there's a little bit of sociological, not quite theory involved in this, but understanding about what makes groups work and how these processes unfold. Because once you understand those things, you're going to be in a much better position to really, don't say manipulate, but engineer to take advantage of or use the opportunities of those group processes and features to create your own methods of trying to create those communities. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is why even bother in the first place? Why create communities in the classroom? Here's a quote from a book, Small Teaching Online by Flower Darby, and the quote is, "The sense of community among learners in a course, something not always achieved very effectively in face-to-face courses, it should be noted, plays an essential role in the effectiveness of the course in producing learning." So what are we talking about here? We're talking about trying to create this sense of community online or even in person as a way of having more effective learning for everybody. And that's an important point. It's not just effective learning for the students, it's also effective learning for the faculty member. And it's by creating this reciprocity of learning, this exchange, that we really can unlock the power of communities of learning. So looking at like what makes a community, what are the parts of community? What are the touch points? What makes a community more than just a group of people that are in a shared location, whether it be in person or online? They share the following elements. First, there's an identity. There's often shared practices that are recognizable to one another that demarcate who that group is. There's a shared sense of beliefs. There's a strong sense of belonging. There can often be a shared history. And history here doesn't have to be generations or millennia. It could be just we shared an experience together, and that creates a bond of history. A shared sense of goals, shared obligations towards reaching those goals, and a feeling of commitment that those goals are worth reaching together. So when you are thinking about a community, one of the things you can look for is to what extent are those elements there? Is there this identity? Is there this sense of belonging? Is there a shared sense of commitment, obligation? Are there shared goals? That's going to be a really key element that we're going to look at, especially in a learning environment that's co-created, where the faculty member and the students come together to create their shared sense of goals and the obligations associated with trying to accomplish those goals. A really nice book I've read recently is by Greg Sattel called Cascades. And what he was looking at here is how social movements emerge. And so you can start to think about what a social movement might look like in your classroom. And he defines an essential element of creating a cascade is the following: this idea of small groups loosely connected but united by a common purpose. And so even if you have teams in your class, small groups, loosely connected, are they unified by a common purpose? Or are they seeing themselves as separate, as in competition with one another? Well, sometimes that can be a good thing. At the same time, while sometimes that might be a good thing, at the same time, that sense of competition can really interfere with a sense of community. So something to keep in mind is, how do we have ourselves moving towards this common goal together, even when we're using teams? And if we're using individuals, if there's no teamwork involved, are we facilitating in some way some kind of group work, some kind of teamwork where we can move together towards this common goal? And so more fundamentally, it raises this question of then, okay, so like what is a community? We have some elements of community. We have movements are created by like these loosely affiliated groups that share a common goal. What's a community? We can go to an author by the name of Peter Block who says the following, quote, communities are human systems given form by conversations that build relatedness. The conversations that build relatedness most often occur through associational life, where citizens show up by choice, rarely in the context of system life, where citizens show up out of obligation. There's a lot going on here, but in terms of what goes on in the classroom, you can think about it in the following ways. To what extent do we form relatedness in the class? To what extent do we facilitate conversations in which students can find some kind of affiliation with one another, where they can see each other in common terms, where they can identify what they share together? It's really hard to form a community when people don't think they have much in common. And so part of the role of community organizer, as we'll see, is creating that sense of connection, creating that sense of affiliatedness, to create the relatedness so people can see themselves being in the same position. And another really key point here is this idea of associational life versus system life. So associational life is this idea that people voluntarily form associations with one another. System life would be situations like institutions where people are forced to come together. The classroom, by and large, is a system life. People are forced into relationships with one another, often for reasons that aren't very compelling, because they need the 3 credit hours, or they need to take the course, or because it fits in a time slot and it checks a box. That's all system life motivated activity. Associational activity is we are here because we want to be here. We're here because we find something in common together. So even though people might be there for a system life, you can still move them along the way to be an associational life. We can still kind of create, as we'll see, create an opportunity where they might be there because it's opportunistic and because they have to. They can build that feeling of connectedness around some kind of cause, a shared identity, a shared sense of obligation, because they have mutually identified goals. And that becomes a really important point in creating these communities of learning. Moving to the virtual, a little bit more challenging, but not impossible, because we know virtual communities exist. Virtual communities have existed for a long time. We can go to the book Virtual Communities, where the author Howard Rheingold says the following, quote, virtual communities are social aggregations that emerge from the net when enough people carry on those public discussions long enough with sufficient human feeling to form webs of personal relationships in cyberspace. And that's in 1993. He was talking about this early thing called the well, which, if you're old enough to remember back when, online communities first started emerging, whether they were AOL chat rooms or things like the well, people started to form these relationships online and form these communities online. And they were demarcated by public discussions. Long enough is a little bit of a gloss, right? What's long enough? Well, it doesn't have to be terribly long, especially when there's sufficient human feeling. When people feel there's an emotive part of being part of this community that further stimulates that connection and helps to further stimulate those personal relationships. One of the key points that we can think about in modern day life are what we call empathetic or empathic communities, often formed around medical conditions or formed around some kind of common challenge people are facing. You'll find really quick trust, really strong connection being formed with those with whom we have no face-to-face encounters. And in fact, a face-to-face encounter might in fact interfere with the ability to form those relationships online. So online communities, contrary to possibly popular belief, are not that hard to form when that sense of identity, sense of belonging, sense of obligation, sense of a shared goal, shared history, all those things are present. We can form virtual communities relatively easily. Harder to do in a system life where those elements aren't there. And so that's when we're kind of, swimming against the tide, so to speak. And so the role of the professor here is unique. It's not just being a teacher, but it's also being a community organizer. raises the question, what is community organizing? Well, here's a quick definition. Community organizing is the process of building power by connecting people with common concerns and mobilizing them to seek the solutions to those problems, identifying the people, the structures that can make those solutions possible, and creating pressure on those targets through negotiation or confrontation to reach a resolution. We're not talking about organizing a community to create some kind of social change in a physical world. So it's a little bit different, but there are still some important elements. This idea of building power. One of the things we would like to do with our students is build power through learning, to empower them. And part of, as we'll see, course co-creation is empowering students to take ownership over their environment, and in the process of doing so, give them power, which then translates into a feeling of pride in their community. So those steps, even though we're not doing it in a neighborhood, those steps still have relevance to building an online community, or even an online learning community, or any kind of learning community. It could even be in a physically co-located classroom. And an idea of what structures make that possible. In the classroom, we have a certain number of levers, as we'll talk about. There are structures that exist that we can use to facilitate this community organizing, to empower students to take ownership over those structures in the classroom so that they feel connected and feel a sense of obligation and ownership and autonomy and trust in that community. And the professor's job, because we often hold the power in the class, is to give up some of that power, give it to the students, and help guide them, facilitate them on the way of becoming a community. And so going back to this idea of what is that part of the community, what are those key characteristics we have? How do we create a shared recognizable identity among students? Can we create a common set of experience through different activities, as we'll talk about? Can we create meaningful goals with them? Can we engage in practices of reciprocity and giving, where we give and they give, we exchange? There is that communal kind of culture. Do they have a sense of belonging and ownership? Are we fulfilling individual needs? What are their individual needs? What are they individually seeking to accomplish, and how can we align those things into collectivities of goals or collections of goals so that they can feel, so the class feels more relevant to them, leading to the sense of accomplishment towards a common goal. That concludes the first part of our video series on how to build communities of learning in the classroom. If you'd like to learn some specific tips and tricks about how you can do this in your classroom, please continue to the second video in this series.